Okay, so uh, are you ready to dive into the world of animation?
Always up for that.
Today, we're going deep with the Animator's Survival Kit, right? It's going to be like peeking behind the curtain to see how those amazing characters we love come to life.
Sounds fascinating. I'm always amazed by how animators can take something as simple as a drawing and give it such life and personality.
It really is magical, isn't it? And what I
Yeah.
love about the Animator's Survival Kit is how it breaks down the process. It's not just a how-to guide, but it really delves into the why behind it all, you know?
Exactly. And the author's passion for animation just shines through. Did you know he was actually inspired to get into animation as a kid because of a book called, get this, How to Make Animated Cartoons?
That's kind of perfect, isn't it? Full circle.
And to top it off, years later, he's blown away by Bambi and ends up working on Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Talk about a dream career. But getting back to the book, one of the key concepts he keeps emphasizing is drawing in time. It sounds obvious, but it's deeper than just, drawing a bunch of pictures. He uses these great illustrations of pigs, and you see how even the slightest change in each drawing, when played in sequence, creates that illusion of movement.
It's like those flip books we used to have as kids, right? Except taken to a whole other level.
Absolutely. And speaking of those early forms of animation, those are pretty ingenious, weren't they? Like the thaumatrope or the zoetrope.
They really were. It's incredible how they captured that same principle of persistence of vision even back then.
It's amazing how those early pioneers saw the potential of animation. Like Winsor McCay, for instance.
Ah, McCay, a true visionary.
The guy was so dedicated to pushing the boundaries. He poured his own money, thousands of dollars, into creating masterpieces like Gertie the Dinosaur, which was groundbreaking for its time.
I know. Gertie wasn't just technically impressive. It was the first time audiences really connected with an animated character, you know? McCay even toured with it, doing these live performances where he'd interact with Gertie projected on stage.
Now it's thinking outside the box. It's sad, though, he became disillusioned with how commercialized the industry became. He felt like the artistry was being overshadowed by profit, which is something that seems to be a recurring theme, wouldn't you say?
Sadly, yes. But despite his frustrations, McCay paved the way for the greats who came after him. And speaking of game changers, that's where Walt Disney comes in.
Oh, absolutely. Disney took those early animation principles and really revolutionized the industry with what he called personality animation, right?
Exactly. Characters like Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, they were so full of life and expression you couldn't help but fall in love with them.
And I think Three Little Pigs was a real turning point. They weren't just moving drawings anymore. They had distinct personalities. They sang, they danced. It was a game changer.
It really was. And then, of course, there's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Can you imagine the sheer scale of that project back then? A full-length animated feature film.
83 minutes. It boggles the mind. No wonder some animators ended up in the hospital.
It's a testament to their dedication and passion for the craft, pushing the limits of what was possible.
Now, let's get into some of the nitty-gritty of how it all works. The Animator's Survival Kit does a fantastic job of explaining these technical aspects in a way that anyone can understand. Like, he really stresses how important spacing and timing are. He uses this really clear example of a bouncing ball to illustrate it.
Right. Where the ball hits the ground, that's your timing. But how close together or far apart the drawings of the ball are, that's your spacing.
And those two elements together create the illusion of weight and movement.
Exactly. It's like a dance between the two. And mastering it is crucial for creating believable animation.
And it's amazing how a simple change in timing can completely transform an action, right? Like, think about a bouncing ball again.
Yeah.
If you change the timing, it can go from a gentle bounce to a heavy thud.
Oh, absolutely. And the spacing comes into play there, too. You can really emphasize the weight and impact of a movement by playing with the spacing of the drawings.
Right, like closer together for a fast movement, farther apart to make it look slower. It's fascinating how those small tweaks make such a difference.
It's all about tricking the eye into seeing motion where there is none. And when it comes to planning out those movements, especially for complex sequences, the book introduces this tool called the X-sheet, which I think is genius.
The X sheet. It sounds kind of intimidating, right?
Maybe at first glance, yeah. But it's actually really clever. It's like a blueprint for an animator, helping them keep track of every single frame and ensuring everything synchronizes perfectly. The movement, the dialogue, the sound effects, everything.
I've seen pictures of them. They look pretty complex with all those columns and numbers.
They are detailed, for sure. That's the beauty of it. You have columns for the action, for dialogue cues, for musical beats. It becomes this visual map of the entire scene.
That makes sense. But how do they decide on the timing? Like, how do you actually determine how many frames something should take?
That's where experience and a good sense of timing come in. Sometimes it's about seconds, sometimes it's about feet for a walk cycle. They even talk about using half seconds for a specific rhythm, like a march.
It's amazing how precise they have to be.
Oh, absolutely. But the book also emphasizes the importance of, not overcomplicating things. Keep it simple.
I like that philosophy. Keep it simple. So we've talked about timing and spacer, but what about the actual process of animating? The book mentions two main approaches, straight ahead and pose to pose.
Yeah, those are the two biggies. It's like choosing your adventure in a way. Think of straight ahead animation like jazz improvisation.
Interesting analogy.
You're going with the flow, creating the action frame by frame. It's spontaneous, full of energy, but it can be a bit like herding cats at times.
Yeah, I can see how that could get messy.
Right.
So what about pose to pose?
That's more like choreographed dancing. You plan out the key poses first, hit those, and then fill in the in-betweens. It's more controlled, precise.
So which approach is better?
It really depends on the scene and the animator style. Sometimes you need that spontaneity of straight ahead. Other times you need the precision of pose to pose. And honestly, a lot of animators use a bit of both.
The best of both worlds. And speaking of animation, something that seems so simple yet so crucial is the walk cycle, right? We do it every day without even thinking, but animating a convincing walk is no easy feat.
You hit the nail on the head. A good walk cycle can make or break a character. And one of the biggest mistakes animators can make is relying too heavily on rotoscoping.
Rotoscoping, that's where they trace over live action footage, right?
Exactly. And while it seems like it would make the movement more realistic, it often ends up looking stiff and lifeless.
Why is that? You'd think tracing over real life would make it look more real.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's because animation needs that extra something, that exaggeration, to really sell the movement. It's about understanding the weight and balance of the body and then pushing those poses just a little bit further.
So it's not just about copying reality, it's about understanding the essence of it and then amplifying it.
Exactly. And speaking of weight, the book has a fantastic section on it. It's not just about gravity, but how a character's weight shifts as they move. Like he says, it's the down position where the legs are bent and the body mass is down where we feel the weight.
I love that. It's such a simple concept, but so insightful.
And it applies to all sorts of movements, not just walking. He even uses the example of a fat man's walk, how the stomach moves up when the body moves down, creating this believable sense of weight and momentum.
It's those subtle details that really bring animation to life.
Absolutely. And while we're talking details, let's not forget about arm movement. It might seem insignificant, but it plays a crucial role in a convincing walk.
Yeah, we don't usually think about it, but our arms swing naturally when we walk.
Exactly. And in animation, you have to consciously recreate that movement. The arms swing in opposition to the legs, creating this natural wave-like motion.
It's like a pendulum, keeping everything in balance.
That's a great way to put it. And you can even use arm movements to add personality to a walk. Like, the book mentions how women often hold their arms closer to their bodies when they walk, which gives them a more graceful, feminine gait.
I never noticed that before, but it's so true. It's amazing how much information we convey through our movements without even realizing it.
Absolutely. And animators need to be masters of observation, picking up on those subtle cues and translating them into their work.
Speaking of translating things, let's go back to the X sheet for a moment. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around how it all works.
Sure, no problem. It can seem a bit overwhelming at first, but once you get the hang of it, it's an amazing tool. Let's talk about counteraction for a second, which the X sheet can help visualize.
Counteract.
Yeah, it's basically the idea that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Like, if a character throws a punch, their whole body leans back first, right?
To give the punch more power.
Exactly. That's counteraction. And you see it everywhere in animation. If a character lifts their arm, their body might subtly lean the other way to compensate.
It's about creating that sense of weight and balance.
Right.
So it looks like the movement is actually happening in a believable way.
Precisely. And it adds so much to the realism, even if it's a subtle movement. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about another dynamic action, running.
Walks and runs. They seem similar, but there's some key differences in how you animate them, right?
You bet. One of the main differences is that in a run, there are moments where both feet are off the ground. You're literally suspended in the air for a split second.
Creating that sense of weightlessness must be tricky.
It is, and it requires a good understanding of timing and spacing, of course.
It all comes back to those fundamentals.
Always. And perspective plays a big role, too, especially when a character is running towards or away from the camera.
Oh, yeah, like those scenes where the character's running down a long hallway or something.
Exactly. You have to use those converging lines and vanishing points to create a sense of depth, making it really pop off the screen.
It's like the difference between a flat image and a 3D world.
Perfectly put. Now, are you ready to get a little weird with animation techniques?
Bring it on.
All right. Let's talk about breaking the joints. It's a technique that allows for more fluidity and exaggeration in movement.
Breaking the joints. Sounds painful.
Don't worry, no animators were harmed in the making of this podcast, but seriously, it's about bending the rules of anatomy to achieve a certain visual flair.
So bending limbs in ways they shouldn't bend.
Pretty much. Imagine bending a joint the wrong way, creating a pose that would be impossible in real life.
It sounds bizarre.
It can be. But in the right hands, it can add a sense of flexibility, cartooniness, and even surrealism to animation.
So it's about knowing the rules of anatomy, but then intentionally breaking them for artistic effect.
Exactly. And when it comes to breaking the joints, one name that comes to mind is Tex Avery.
Oh, Tex Avery, the king of wacky animation.
That's the one. He was a master of using this technique to create those over-the-top, hilarious movements that made his cartoons so unique.
It's amazing how he could bend reality and still make it so entertaining.
And it all comes back to understanding those fundamental principles we've been talking about. Avery's work might be exaggerated, but it's still grounded in solid animation principles.
It's like he was playing a different game, you know? Like he was bending the rules of physics and anatomy just to see what he could get away with.
And he got away with a lot, but always in service of the story and the humor.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so brilliant. He knew how to push those boundaries without completely breaking the audience's suspension of disbelief. It's a delicate balance, for sure.
It really is, and it's a testament to his skill as an animator that he could pull it off so effectively. Now, speaking of balance, something else that struck me about the book was how much he emphasizes the importance of imperfection in animation.
Imperfection? You mean like mistakes?
Not exactly mistakes, but more like those little quirks, those subtle deviations from perfect realism that actually make animation more appealing.
I think I know what you mean. Like if everything was perfectly symmetrical and smooth, it might look kind of, I don't know, sterile.
Exactly. A little too perfect, a little too robotic. It's those imperfections, those little nuances of timing and spacing that give characters their charm and make them feel more relatable.
He talks about something called the elongated in-between, right?
Yeah, that's a great example of what we're talking about. It's where you subtly stretch or compress a drawing to enhance the feeling of movement. It's like adding a bit of a rubber band effect, making the animation feel more fluid and organic.
It's funny because it's those little imperfections that often make hand-drawn animation so much more appealing than some computer animation, wouldn't you say?
100%. There's a warmth, a human touch to those imperfections that's hard to replicate with a computer.
It's like the difference between a perfectly straight line drawn with a ruler and a line drawn freehand. The freehand line might have a little wobble to it, but it also has more character, more life.
I love that analogy. And ultimately, that's what animation is all about, right? Bringing those drawings to life, infusing them with personality, emotion, and a little bit of that beautiful imperfection that makes us human.
Absolutely. It's taking something static and giving it a heartbeat, a soul. It's about those moments that make us laugh, cry, and everything in between.
And that's the magic of animation, isn't it? It has the power to transport us to other worlds, to make us believe in the impossible, and to connect with characters as if they were real people.
All thanks to the artistry and dedication of those who breathe life into those drawings.
And who continue to push the boundaries of what's possible in this ever-evolving art form.
Well said. And for all of you listening, we encourage you to keep an eye out for these principles next time you're watching your favorite animated film or show. You might be surprised by how much you notice.
It's like having a secret decoder ring for understanding the magic behind the scenes.
So, from drawing in time to breaking the joints, we hope this deep dive into the Animator Survival Kit has given you a newfound appreciation for the art and craft of animation. It's a world of endless possibilities, limited only by the imagination. And on that note, it's time for us to say goodbye, but we hope you'll join us again for another deep dive into the fascinating world of film and storytelling.